Another day in paradise. All right, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I get it. There you go. So Nehemiah, part 6. If you want to make your way to Nehemiah, we're actually going to launch from chapter 4 today, but a little bit of an intro before we get there, but I'll give you time to find it. Nehemiah Chapter 4, part 6 of the study. I'll just say that I have to go, I don't have to, but I do go fairly quickly. No shock, right? Everybody knows that. But that's because we have it on video. That's because we have it on video. So you can just go to that, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You just get notifications when there's new videos uploaded. And forgive the presentation, but there's some good information there at any rate. So let's talk about calendars at the beginning. So unlike the social media, I'm thinking, solar calendar, ancient Hebrew calendar, to which, for example, if you look Nehemiah, if you found 4, then it's not but a couple pages back to chapter 1, or a couple of flips on your electronic device to get there. You'll see chapter 1, verse 1, Kislev in Hebrew. This is a month in the Hebrew calendar. This is a lunar calendar. And so as boring as what I'm going to tell you right now is, just hang in there with me, because we're going to make reference to time and how time is significant to Nehemiah. This Hebrew lunar calendar contained 12 months of 30 days, and since the actual lunar cycle is 29.5 days a year, by lunar calendar reckoning, it's something like 354.5 days. So to rectify this, an additional month was added. So the Hebrews thought, well, instead of like leap, so we have like a leap year, and we add a day to February, in our calendar. They would add a month, and so one of the months was Adar, and they would add Adar Sheni. Sheni is like second or another, so it's like a second Adar. They would add, and they would do this every 7 out of 19 years, and it's just not that arbitrary. They have it actually down to which years in that 19-year period. They've got this all worked out. This leap month was put in. So this explains why, for example, Easter, which is coming up for us, Easter and Pentecost are movable on the, in other words, they change time during the year on our solar calendar, for example. So the Christian Easter and the Jewish Passover, in essence, these should overlap, correspond, link, but they don't. And that's because back in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea meeting for any number of reasons, which were all pretty significant reasons, discussing who Jesus is. Now they said, let's mess with the calendar, right? So this is a Christian council, by the way. So they decided for determining the date of Easter as a recurring kind of annual celebration. We'll do it the first Sunday following the first full moon after the spring equinox, which we just passed, a moment or a bit ago, so March 21st. So sometime between the March 22nd and April 25th. So I went to the calendar this morning. I went to the calendar and I said, yep, it sure does hold. Easter is the 8th, something like that, the 4th, whatever, but if you back up to when the full moon is after the equinox, it works. But that's why it changes, and it changes from year to year and thing like that. It can be a little painful. We were talking the other day about how come somebody just didn't decide to have it on this day and be done with it. But now we know. So we'll get back to all things calendar and how that helps us as a bit of an interpretive key, and probably interpretive in the sense of understanding the mind of Nehemiah and why he is putting these time references and kind of signposting throughout his book using multiple references to time. We'll get back to that in a second, but let's just look at Nehemiah chapter 4 and verses 4 through 6. And probably like you, I've just been plowing through the book as we go through the thing and circling it back around and finding everything I missed. But Nehemiah 4, 4 to 6, hear us, our God. Of course, the context is, again, opposition. You can trace this throughout the book, So take a reading through the book, and then assign yourself some homework, like a different reason. Like, what am I looking for this reading? So, the problem with that is you end up with, a bunch of multiple colors and crazy arrows and notes and stuff like that. That's good, right? So you could take a reading and say, how many instances of opposition can I find in the book? And so this morning when I was rereading it again, I was doing that. I was saying, well, what are these multiple references to opposition? And one of the things I found that I had not noticed before, or maybe I noticed but I didn't pay attention, how that works, was you start out with a couple, namely like Sanballat and Tobiah, and then we kept getting more. We had Geshem to that. And then it got to be that the enemies were so numerous that that's what it said. It listed those three guys and then the rest of them. He literally says that at one point later on. And the rest of the enemies, something like that. But within this context then of opposition, because you see in chapter 4 and verse 1, when Sanballat, and the reason why he doesn't give his genealogical derivation or his country of origin is because we know Sanballat by now. He's been mentioned previous. So it says, when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, blah, blah, blah. And you have then the war of words and ridiculing things of that nature. What's the response? Response is, we'll get into this in slightly more detail in a moment, just to point out some of these details. But just for reading it now. Chapter 4, verse 4, hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. I think of, turn the counsel of Ahithophel to lies, something like that from the lips of David. Then give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight. I thought it interesting, guilt and sins relative to people who are not under the Mosaic covenant, right? So outside the bounds of the law and yet guilty of sin. You say, well, how does that work, right? So I think that's an interesting little insight into the fact that, sins are not so because of the law. The law did expose the sinfulness of man, but basically sins are against God and his nature. And I thought, how interesting this is. But he says, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So somehow this is all constituted as somehow being connected with God and his purposes, therefore sinning against God. Anyway, not to get off track. So he says, verse 6, so we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. So just note this little phrase in verse 6, chapter 4, verse 6, till all of it reached half its height. Now I'm going to call this the tipping point. Let's see in the whole plan. So far we've identified two discrete, separate, individual plans, because twice Nehemiah said that the Lord laid this on my heart, his way of saying, God delivered his plan to me, and then we differentiated those two plans as being like setting your house in order. Step one, step two is then occupying the house, right? So those two parts, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But I'm calling this the tipping point, or I'm suggesting it. It's, we say either the turning point, maybe, the turning point, the tipping point. It's a point where you could say, well, things could go either way at this point. And in reading the book and in looking at the context, you could say, yeah, things could go either way. And you say, well, no, they couldn't, because we know which way they went. But just hang with me for a second. So I say, well, why lay a foundation, given the Hebrew calendar and all this? Why lay a foundation for this observation of Nehemiah? his observation. So this is what we did. We rebuilt the wall till it reached half of its height, this type of thing. So we have to keep in mind, just to speak with reference to time now, that this writing, Nehemiah's accounting of this, is from a distant vantage point, historical vantage point, after the walls have been completed. So we've said that first plan, and let's use the house analogy. It is rather fitting here because Nehemiah refers to that. There would come a time to rebuild the wall. Then what did we point out last week? Then it came a time to build the houses, to settle in the precincts proper of the city, and then out in the towns and the villages. But first we get job one done. First we do that. So, like for example, just if you need to root this in something in the book for some justification, chapter 2 and verse 8. If you look at that, and may I, now this is Nehemiah before Artaxerxes making his case and his appeal prior to going back to Jerusalem. And he says, and may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and, now watch, for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. I'm just saying there's an allusion there. And I'm not making a big deal out of it. I'm just saying there's an allusion there to sort of like two phases, right? So he's not saying, give me the timber so that I can make a nice house for myself, and then from that point of security and stability, we'll proceed with the wall. So you can just see the ordering is there in the mind of Nehemiah, and no doubt that is driven, influenced, or informed by the plan that God had delivered to his heart. So what I'm saying is, what other precedent is there for people in Scripture, and I'd say it's probably the majority of the case, writing from a more distant vantage point? Certainly, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch as things were occurring. He wasn't doing that, but from a more, and some postulate, well, it's probably 1440 or whatever, when he was parked in the wilderness somewhere, that he took opportunity to put this down in writing on vellum or whatever. But I would suggest to take a look at the gospel writers, for example, because they're writing, much like Nehemiah, as eyewitnesses, but from a distant vantage point. This is not incidental, but I think significant to how you sort of understand Nehemiah, understand the gospel writers. So let's say writing from a distant vantage point. What would that distant vantage point be, right? And we don't often think of this way because many folks, because they'll open up the Bible and they'll say Nehemiah here at this place in the canon and assume that it is chronologically proximate to, now it is to Ezra, we get that, but to other books, same thing as the gospel writers. You tend to say, well, here's Matthew, Mark, Luke, of course those three writing in similar times, Mark probably first, then John a bit later. And you'd say, well, okay, so all that happened, and those guys, those gospel writers, because in the canon, and you're looking in, in here, and you're saying all that's before the book of Acts, then they would have had no knowledge of, the book of Acts. They would have had no knowledge of Paul's writings and things like that, when in fact they are writing from a more distant vantage point of a period much previous. For example, Jesus had already ascended, the Holy Spirit had come upon his people, and the church had been established. And you have to know that when you read Matthew. You have to know that when you read Mark. Now, it's just a matter of how long, whether it's been a couple decades or 3 or 4 decades, something like that. And so these guys are writing the Gospels with a full knowledge that the events that they are describing in the text are relative now to Jesus already dying on the cross, already having these resurrection appearances, the church not only just being established at Pentecost, the coming of the Spirit of God, but Paul's, not all of his, obviously, all of his missionary journeys per se can be contemporaneous with the writing of those Gospels, depending on the dating, but so on and so on. And you get the idea. So not to go granular, and in the weeds on all that stuff, but nevertheless, just to make that mental note, and you need to think about that. So when one writes, let's say as Nehemiah, so as to describe events from a distant vantage point, one does so in at least one of two ways in terms of their historical perspective, right? So as a historian, number one, it'd be without firsthand knowledge of the events. Hence, if I am writing, let's say, a volume on U.S. history, I am not writing it as an eyewitness. That is, as far as the period. Like if I'm going, let's say, pre-Civil War, something like that, then obviously I'm not writing it as an eyewitness. So that's one way. And so you tend to assemble all of the historical data that you can get your hands on, and then you're looking at believe me, there's a whole way of assessing the value and the authenticity of certain historical texts and things of that nature. But you have to do all that. There's a whole science to it. And you have to do all of that stuff. But then a second way, so that's without firsthand knowledge, but a second would be to write as a historian, which of course Nehemiah is doing here, but with firsthand knowledge as an eyewitness. So Nehemiah, much like the gospel writers would do much later, gives us an eyewitness accounting as though we are in Jerusalem, on the ground. For example, just look at chapter 2, verses 11 and following, and look at how he writes this, right? Because he's saying, so I went to Jerusalem, and he really gives us enough graphic detail here as though we are walking with him. So he's basically going through the rubble, going through the debris, and he's telling him, I'm doing this at night, I'm examining. He's really helping us get an on the ground picture in real time, so to speak. He's kind of writing it that way. So he's doing so through recollection and reflection. I think those are two things, right? So recollection would be in terms of the precise details and how things happen, but then reflection is, now from a distant vantage point, right? So you begin to look at all those. I mean, imagine in real time, you wouldn't necessarily connect the dots, but you and I know it, like if we were writing our own biography and going back through, right? And we wouldn't just recollect, but then we begin to reflect. And you'd say, well, I wonder why this, of course we all do this, right? Why did that happen, and at that time, and in that way, and so on. And even though it's an inexact science for us, because there's a bit of subjectivity to that, right? But nonetheless, then we begin to reflect or connect the dots. And so Nehemiah's reflecting really bleeds through the text. And I could cite different places, but one would be, just as an example, chapter 2 and verse 6, so he says, and this for whatever reason appeals to me, but he says, then the king and then this parenthetical little comment, right? He says, then the king with the queen sitting beside him. It's that little expression, with the queen sitting beside him. I mean, why this detail? It doesn't seem to be relevant. You could take it out, and it doesn't change the historical value of the record. But for me, I have to say it's in there. It's in there for a reason. Of course, we know that, right? Because God doesn't waste words. He doesn't give us extra words. He doesn't give us insufficient. He just gives us what he has. But it meant something to Nehemiah in reflection. In reflection, I believe. So perhaps she had some influence on the king. And this goes along with his prayer, which began halfway through verse 4, right? Then I prayed I threw one up to God. I got to go before the king, and so I threw one up to God, and maybe because he saw her sitting there, I I don't know, but it's an important detail for him. Or perhaps she was a threat, to the mission, as I said. Maybe she was a threat to them. Who knows? Maybe she wasn't a threat. Maybe it was, oh God, maybe she can influence him, something. So, okay, time, sequence, dates, all things Hebrew calendar. So this is relevant to our understanding of any historical work, let alone a firsthand eyewitness accounting of the events from the author, various points in succession, So he's going to give us a bunch of these markers throughout the book because he's seeing things as they, and this is important, right? This is important. Nehemiah is not giving us some ad hoc, chaotic kind of scrambling. There's what's called specified complexity and then just complexity to go all things physics, perhaps. Complexity is just there's a whole bunch of stuff, but yet it's not really any discernible sense to it. It's just complex. But then specified complexity is each part relates to the other, and you can see the reasoning. Classic example would be if I threw on a whiteboard just a whole bunch of letters all mixed up and everything else, you'd say, wow, that's complex. But if I ordered them into words and in sentences and paragraphs, you'd say, okay, now it's meaningful because it's specified. So we're seeing Nehemiah do a bit of that. He's saying, there are a whole bunch of these points, reference points, and I'm going to suggest that it's done by time. I'm just going to use this as like an interpretive key into the mind of Nehemiah just because I'm watching what he does and I'm just trying to pay attention to what he does. There's all these various points, and they're not random, but they are associated by him in a specific ordering of events that leads to the completion of a project. So you can imagine that, basically on the ground level, you're unaware really of the connection of all this stuff. You're just dealing with this day, and all this day's got, then the next day, I'll take the next day, what happened last week, and so on. But imagine you, like if God could somehow elevate you, which is what I think God does. When he gives us scripture, he takes a human being who's on the ground in real time doing this stuff, has him author it, but then we get the perspective of the one who transcends all of this historical stuff to see just how the dots are connected. So, for example, in real time, that is with Nehemiah, at the moment, not from the distant vantage point when he's writing this, but at the moment, only faith could project future outcomes. I mean, think about it. If it's you, and this is your life in this moment, and I was to somehow come to you in some prophetic sense and tell you, hey, don't worry. Now, we get the platitude, don't worry, it's all going to work out, don't worry. And yet, who authorized you to tell me that? And they can say, well, trust God, it's all going to work out. And it's not wrong. It's not wrong knowing who God is, right? But in real time, that's what we have is faith. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's what Nehemiah, we have to say, he's writing in a more, let's just say, in a more relaxed, non-stressful time, and reflecting back on a very stressful time when he had all the pressures of opposition, of this workforce and getting all this done. So Nehemiah, and you can see his faith coming out strongly. And I don't think he's being self-serving by writing this about himself, even from a distant point, and saying, but this is what happened, and this is what I did. I prayed. This is where the people were, and I told them it's okay. God's going to fight for us. Don't be concerned about it. But he was doing all that in real time. But here in hindsight, Nehemiah, remember, he's reflecting. He can reflect on the significance of each point now in sequence and infuse into the account this absolute certainty as to why this was so important or why that point was so necessary. I think that basically you superimpose that on the gospel writers. And you wonder, why do they focus on this? Why do they give this detail? It's because they see that particular detail in relation to God's redemptive purposes and his outcome. And I think people fail to see this. But we should take note. So in our little few moments that we have, I'd like to talk about this chapter 4, this one little verse, chapter 4, verse 6, as being this tipping point. Okay, now it's only a tipping point in real time. It's not a tipping point from a distant vantage point. So I make that dichotomy, right? So in real time, Nehemiah has to be thinking, oh my Lord, and I mean that in the most literal sense. He must be crying out to God thinking, could the plan be in jeopardy? Could this opposition be working? And so there's various references to time in Nehemiah and also the passing of time. And he wants the readers to know what time it is. And I mean that kind of figuratively. And how long is the duration between points in sequence to the completion of the wall? Because for our purposes, right, who we might be facing similar pressures, similar stresses as Nehemiah, to know what time it is. Where am I in this? Am I at a tipping point where things could go either way? I could either just jettison the whole thing and quit and yield to opposition, or am I at a point where there's going to be a determination, let's see this thing through, come what may, right? So let me just give you a few whys as to why I think he puts these various time signposts throughout. One is for authenticity of his written record to be recognized by those who would read it sometime later. Posterity could point back and say, yeah, that's authentic. That did happen at that particular time and that way. Right? So every time somebody gives a speech, a politician, not naming anyone in particular, but every time they give a speech nowadays, there's what? The fact-checking, right? There's the fact-checking either by the media or somebody, and they're going to go to every little detail, and just, as they should, right? And check to make sure that what you're saying is accurate. So I think that is what Nehemiah is doing, number one, because he's saying, please, I'm not fabricating any of this. I'm not embellishing any of this. I'm not taking any literary license. I think a second thing would be to indicate a sequence, as I mentioned before. That is, there's an ordering of events. It was aligned with the plan. And you would only know that after the fact. You would only know that from a distant vantage point when you finally can look back even on your life and see that in that particular moment, I thought that was horrific. I thought it was over. I thought I was done. I thought I was finished. But now, as I get the greater context of this, I can see meaning to that. Ultimately, it's a bit subjective. We may not know 100%, and we're always careful to say, oh, that happened because of I know that happened because of this. And I don't mean to imply that. But I'm just saying, from a more distant vantage point, and listen, whatever doubts we had of God in the moment, right? Let's just say in the moment, when we just shot back to God some prayers of doubt or consternation or frustration, from a more distant vantage point, looking back 100%, God is always exonerated. I can promise you that as being, like any of us, being one of many that have experienced, some of life's negative things, right? Never once have I looked back and said, God let me down there. God, if there was any letting down, it's me letting God down. It's never the other way around. But I found that God is always exonerated. You cannot historically, speaking of your own life, prove that God is anything less than loving, faithful, gracious, kind, and everything that his word declares him to be, right? So just to indicate the sequence, in other words, that God and Nehemiah, if I'm to impose some theological observations on him, I'd say that he's trying to tell us that this God that we serve is not a pragmatic being. He's not pragmatic, nor does he act in an ad hoc way. This is just infused with, even though some of the events could seem discordant and disconnected if you were on the ground at that time, Why would God call me to do something like rebuild his wall if he knew that there were going to be, and for example, just go to chapter 4 and verse 7. And I'm going to show you geographically, why would God have us rebuild a wall and then literally surround us with enemies while we're doing it? And I can prove. You just do the homework yourself. But when Sanballat, that's to the north, and Tobiah, the Arabs, it says, that's to the south, the Ammonites, that's to the east, and the people of Ashdod, that's to the west. Literally surrounded. So why would God do that? So things can look discordant, they can look chaotic, and all that stuff. But then when you see things from a more distant vantage point, God is exonerated. So God gives a plan to someone. Then God, who gives the plan, sees the plan to completion. Now listen carefully to this. So it's how you see God. And if you see God in terms of all your exigencies, all the difficulties, you see God in terms of all the contingencies, instead of seeing God in his nature. This is what we struggle with, myself included, right? This is a universal issue with human nature. Okay, we see God in terms of things that we need in order to do that instead of who God is. So I would suggest to you that the Bible describes God as a being who is sufficient in himself. So that's a bit of a philosophical statement, if not completely a philosophical statement. But by God being sufficient in himself, it means that God alone is sufficient to provide for every single exigence, every single contingent, all those things. So there is not a need that we did not foresee somehow. I have to stop here, I have to quit here because I didn't foresee that happening, right? But we say that God, who called us, is sufficient in himself. God is not bound. We're bound by time, we're bound by circumstance. God is not. So the one who gave the plan is perfectly sufficient in himself. What does that mean? You cannot fail because he cannot fail. All things being equal. You're in tune with God. God has called you. You're doing his work, his way, and so on. So let me give you a third thing, and that's it's to why Nehemiah is making reference to all this time. And that's, here's the third thing, is to instill a pace in the pace. You get this, right? I'll give you, just to illustrate that, the book of Mark. I give you the book of Mark. We see this in the Gospel of Mark. Mark intentionally and grammatically gives us words and structures his gospel this way to give us a pace. I mean, most think it's in the form of a kerygma, it's in the form of a sermon, right? That Mark reads like a sermon. It's unique in the synoptics. But here's something else. 410, so there's 678 verses. 410 of those begin with a Greek word kai, which is the conjunction and, like and. So I'll just give you an example because this doesn't come out in the English. So Mark chapter 1, 5, 6, and 7, the whole Judean countryside, but it starts with and the whole Judean. Verse 6, John wore and John wore. Verse 7, you get the and. The and comes out in the English. But I'm just saying in the Greek text, you get this and. And I don't know about you, but if you're talking to somebody who's really, really hyper and they keep saying and then and, you're like, okay. So their pace, is going fairly quickly. If they keep slinging all these things together with and, you get the sense of what? Rapid succession of this sort of like it's a literary way of simulating the advancement of time. But I think that's probably really not getting to the heart of it. I think it's a literary device to say this stuff that's happening, there's a certain immediacy to it and a certain import to it. And that's what I think Mark was trying to convey in this. As a matter of fact, not just the term kai being used Only 410 times to begin. It's only. If you look at just chapter 1 alone, and I can't bring this out in the English version, but Mark uses another word. If we're unconvinced, and you say, Doug, I think if you lost your mind, to just think that there's a succession of and. And you're saying, is there some more direct way that Mark could want us to know the immediacy? How about if he used the word immediate, which he does 42 times. This is chapter 1 alone. Verse 10, 12, 18, 20, 21, 23, 28, 29, 30, 42, 43. You're just reading the first chapter. And immediately. So you get the and, immediately. So I think this is what Nehemiah is doing just a little bit, and I'll just do a big flyover of the book. He starts out in chapter 1 and verse 1, mentioning Kislev. I'm just anglicizing the pronunciation for the purists. Kislev, that's November, December. It's also the period of the early rains. Then he mentions Nisan in chapter 2 and verse 1, the period of the latter rains, but that's a religious new year. Chapter 1 and verse 11, he mentions 3 days. Chapter 1, 12, and 15, he mentions during the night, and then by night, and then 1:17, no longer, a reference to time. 1:18, let us start, a reference to time. 4 and 6 that we read a moment ago, until. 4 and 9, day and night. Chapter 4, verse 12, 10 times over. Chapter 4, verse 16, from that day on. Chapter 4, verse 21, so we continued. All of these references to a period of time, either a month or the duration. Those two things, some punctiliar aspect and then the duration. Chapter 5, 14, 12 years. Chapter 5, verse 18, each day. Chapter 6, verse 4 times. Verse 5, the 5th time. He's keeping track of how many times his oppressors keep coming to him. Okay, I got 1, I got 2, I got 3. Chapter 6 and verse 10, one day. One day. Chapter 6 and verse 15 is the month of Elul. That's August, September on our calendar. And then he mentions shortly after that what? Not just the month. The wall was completed in this month. But he does what? He says in 52 days. And Elul was the dry season. So every single period of the year meteorologically is put in there. Chapter 7 verse 1 after. Chapter 8 verse 1. Tishri, another mention of a month. September, October, that's the dry season. So that would be the 4th, and all the way through here. Also the beginning of the civil new year. So chapter 8 verse 1 also marks 6 months since chapter 2 and verse 1. And so why is that important? It's because Nehemiah is trying to say, listen, do you realize with God, despite innumerable enemies that we quit listing them, that all of this happened in 6 months. So forget the 52 days for a moment, because that's a completion of the wall. Expand your thinking to 6 months. Think of 6 months of your life, Some years you'd want to say, okay, that's a lot of stuff happened in there. But think of 6 months. He's saying, that was time to pack up and leave Persian-controlled Babylon. It's time to organize provisions, to set out for Jerusalem, to inspect the project site, to convince the people, to begin the work, to deal with opposition, to complete the work, and receive and implement Plan 2. All that by chapter 8, verse 1, but it didn't stop there. Chapter 8 and verse 2, the first day, 8:13, the second day, 8 and 18, day after day. Chapter 9, verse 1, the 24th day of the same month, that's Tishri. And so now things begin. Once the wall is complete, we seem to get more text and a broader period of time. Chapter 12 and verse 27, the dedication of the wall, that would have been a particular day. 12:44 at that time, 13:1 on that day, 13:23 in those days. So that's a very imperfect run-through, just a quick run-through of all of the specific allusions to time that Nehemiah makes. If you see that many times, how does it not sink in? what is Nehemiah trying to tell us? Because he could have written this any other way. He could have written multiple ways. But in this particular sense, he does it to give us, I think, the point that every event, whether consequential or not to us, occurs within the greater framework of God's plan and the outworking of his plan. So he could give us a lot more detail. Some of these just seem so mundane, and others seem more significant, but that's life. That's life. There's going to be the mundane and the ordinary, and it's infused with God's blessing. It's infused. Even the mundane, simple, ordinary things that we even forget. I'm horrible at remembering. I don't know. Some things I can, other things I can't, or maybe I should say I don't. I don't know how that works. Maybe it's laziness, but there's something about, I think, people that journal, people that do that, and they really write out. They then can see God's thumbprint on their life. They can see God's footprint, leading them. But when you journal and you look specifically, I do that. I won't pull the iPhone down, but I do that electronically on there, and I don't do it regularly. But from time to time, I'll go through a stretch where I'll just start, going into the notes and adding files and just recounting. This is what's going on. You go back and look at that, and you say, "Oh, I forgot." I forgot. I forgot a lot of those things. But from a distant vantage point now, you go pull a journal out from 10 years ago, from 15 years ago, and then you could begin to see how all of these things begin to align. Even something that is catastrophic and heartbreaking and heart-rending, that one little moment that in that time you felt like, wow, everything has fallen apart. Everything I've built is somehow crushed, and everything I've invested so much emotional, physical, financial energy into, and so on. Whatever that might be, and you can't understand it. And this is how God says through his word and through somebody like Nehemiah, well, you need to just transcend that, and only time will allow you to do that. So in real time, just like Nehemiah, you have to take that on faith. I just know God, and I know God's going to take care of me. God's going to do this. And you write that in your journal, right? I have no idea, God, but I know you're God, and you're going to take care of this. But then some journal entry, 5 years, 2 years, 1 month, 10 years down, and you're going to say, yeah, you did take care of it. You did do this. And keeping in mind that 100% God will always be exonerated. See, we see history, the succession of history, without the ability, because we're not God, without the ability to see how all the dots connect. So it's like this kid who wants to see a parade. He says, there's going to be a parade in town. But he gets buried behind the crowd. He can't see the parade. So he goes down some side street, some narrow side street, and then he feels thwarted again because there's a wooden fence, and he can't climb up. He can't see where the kid feels thwarted. But he punches out a knot, so he's got a little knot hole in that fence, and he sticks his eye up to it. He can see the parade, but he can only see it just one. That's how we do history. That's how we see things. On faith, based on Scripture, we can say, yeah, but I know the one who sees it all. I know the one who knows the end from the beginning. So Nehemiah is helping us in this regard to transcend this sort of finite way that we see things. The individual events as they contribute to this unified whole. That's where we are. Our biggest frustration a lot of times in life is we see all these individual events, and they seem discordant to us. They seem confused. They seemed out of place. It's just counterintuitive to look at that, what appears to be confusing, and see any sense in it whatsoever, because we can't see the unified whole. That's that whole deductive-inductive thing. How we approach stuff. Deductively, you see the whole. Inductively, you see the details, and you focus on the details, and you don't want to do one without the other. You just never want to do that. And so for Christians, we have the whole. We have the whole of history. The complete totality of human history here. So we shouldn't get, what's a nice way? been out of shape or overly concerned, overwrought about the details when we know the whole, right? That's the benefit of Scripture. So in chapter 4, I'm saying 4 to 6 is this tipping point, and it's worth noting that Nehemiah describes this tipping point as occurring when the entire wall, if you notice that literally the expression is the entire wall was at half its height. Really, this is interesting. The entire thing, and it's that way in the Hebrew for a reason. It actually adds that in there so that we know exactly this is the definitive halfway point. Not just that some of those groups that worked this part, they were doing really, really well, and the other part, not so well, they were a little slower. Nehemiah managed to get all of these people working with each other and all getting so that it had this equally proportioned thing all the way around. Another thing that he's pointing out here. But we should note that what's occurring in the context that helps us get a handle on what this tipping point is. So just a few things here while we wind it down. One, you can see in the context, we won't go there to point it out, but you can see it in the context, this constant jeering. You'll see the word ridicule and all this stuff. This whole thing that sticks and stones will break your bones, names will never hurt you is garbage, right? Because more people would rather have a broken arm than deal with the insults, that are given to them, the words. And case in point here, these surrounding nations could have come at them with armies, but instead they came at them with words because they knew the culture. They knew it, and they knew it. This is all it would take. This is what it would take, how powerful it was, and it was working. Nehemiah could see its effect. It was absolutely working. So second thing, you see Nehemiah's prayer. Nehemiah prays with great specificity in terms of his requests and the reasons for those requests. So then 3, the prayer, this cry of Nehemiah was instrumental in turning the fear of the people away from the words and toward the God in faith. This is important to note, the fear-faith interchange here. So the idea of we're praying, Nehemiah says this is working, they're afraid, so let's pray that their hearts would be turned away from what's causing them fear, namely the words, and be focused on God in faith. So again, that sounds like a big platitude, right? So we should look at that a little bit. Because it is rather axiomatic. We say, of course, we need to stop being afraid and trust God. For example, Psalm 56, verses 3 and 4 and 11. What does the psalmist say? When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. And then he reverses it. In God I trust and I'm not afraid. So he's saying, okay, the one is what I do when I'm afraid. The other is what I do to keep from being afraid. But then he goes on, and you just see, for example, what's he afraid of? In verse 5, this is the psalmist. This is the culture, right? All day long they twist my words, right? So words, again, they conspire, they lurk, they watch me, so on and so on. Verse 9, by this I will know that God is for me. What? In God, whose word I praise. Verse 10, in the Lord now, uses all caps. And there's a reason for that. Whose word I praise, in God I trust and am not afraid. So if you look back at Nehemiah chapter 1, and you say, well, where did Nehemiah get his basis for wanting to confess to God, wanting to approach God in a certain way? It came from his understanding of who God is. So just note this is really subtle, sort of. But chapter 1 and verse 5, Lord, see that all caps? Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him. What's he looking at? He's looking at the very nature of God here, this covenant-keeping God. So fear is a matter of looking in the wrong place rather than trusting in the right person. This is what Nehemiah concludes, and this is what you would conclude as well from, say, Matthew chapter 14, and this whole account, Jesus walking on the water, 14. If you look at verse 30 of that, it says, and this is, of course, where we would go. We go to the heart of this thing and say, well, where can we find a case where somebody lost focus, and gave way to fear rather than maintaining their eyes on God and trusting in him. I would say, the easiest verse to cannibalize or text to cannibalize would be this one. But when he, that is Peter, saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, Lord, Lord, save me. And you compare that with verse 25, for example, not just Peter. Peter was not the only one following this example. You just have to back up in the context to find a precedent. He's sort of like a subset of the full set of disciples. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the water, and when the disciples what? Saw him, they were terrified. And you see the same pattern. So the cause of the problem and the solution of the problem are all here, obviously. Because even in all of this, it says in verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And I think about that, and I think here's a guy who, he was walking out, really, he's walking out, I could see the waves, going, and I probably one crest of the wave sort of blocked his view, of the Lord for a reason. You have to go to find the right artist rendering of that scene to get there. But perhaps that was the case. And he goes from being an instrument of the miraculous to drowning, really, because that's the verb here, when he began to sink. But the verb, if you look at the verb, he's bobbing, and he's drowning. He's actually going down and could drown. So lots we could say about this, namely, if you just look at the entire thing instead of just picking out this sort of proof text, if you will, you find this whole case where Jesus goes off by himself to pray, and he circles back, and the disciples go off in the boat. The boat. And Jesus, knowing they're in trouble out there, because what does it say? Verse 24, buffeted by the waves and the wind was against them. Jesus being very practically here, right? Very practically. I'm going to go to them and I'm going to help them. No boat. He walks on the water. I think the miracle is a practical means for him getting to them in their worst moment. And if you really want to generalize that and say, in your worst moment, God can come to you in this way. Not walking on something per se, but I'm saying, don't discount the role of some miraculous intervention of God in your worst hour or in your best hour, maybe. But life's tipping points, life's tipping points are this way. We're either going to feed our fears, or we're fueling our faith, right? So fueling faith, this is as necessary as breathing or eating is to our physical well-being. In fact, it's more important. More important than eating or breathing, if something could be, is this idea of fueling your faith. Now, how can I say that? Just do a simple Google search. Anybody can do that. And just Google prayer and fasting in the Bible. Just do it. Prayer and fasting. Right? So prayer and fasting, as a matter of fact, if you want one that fits within our study, it's chapter 1 and verse 4. See, what did Nehemiah do when he's hearing this news? Instead of feeding fear, he fuels faith. Because what does he do? When I heard those things, I sat down and wept, I mourned and fasted and prayed. So now you're seeing the priority of fueling your faith. So whatever situation you find yourself in, you're in one of these places. Which side of the coin is it flipped? Where are you? You're either in this situation and in your thought life and in your actions and your behavior and all this stuff going to be feeding the fears. Everything going on as you look in your life, every single situation, you are going to be interpreted as being just completely justified for being afraid, right? You're going to do this, and people do this. They look at their circumstances. See, there's a reason. Why should I not be afraid? Why should I not be terrified? Because here's all my reasons, justification. I look around at my circumstances. Others, like Nehemiah, would be fueling their faith, right? They'd be fueling their faith. Why is it that when the people were ready to quit, Nehemiah was the stand-up guy? Nehemiah was a stand-up guy, and in real time, all he had was faith. Two last things. But one would be to prepare. A fourth thing would be to prepare for battle, and you see this in the latter part of chapter 4. So they're ready, right? So the people are going to continue to work, but in what context? We're halfway done, and so now the next verse after halfway done is north, south, east, and west. Boom! The enemies are descending upon them. So what do we expect? We expect the heat to get turned up. We really do. We have this sense that God's called me to this great noble thing. I'm a Christian, therefore I'm preserved from, or something, or I'm entitled to, something like this. Yet we live in a world that is very predatorial against our personal life and even the movement of God's people in this world. So we have to be prepared for the temperature, to increase. So a last thing would be to continue to work, though the circumstances say defeat. Right? Are you going to do that? Really? I mean, honestly, you can look at people and say, "What are they crazy? Don't they see what I see?" What keeps them going? What keeps them still confident? That God is with them and God is working. And if you look at chapter 4, I mean, it's an interesting read. You go down through there as you plow through it again this week, and you'll see just what they were up against, and just. Chapter 4, verse 14 is saying, God will fight for us. Verse 20, God will fight for us. And so that's all we need to do. That's the only answer we need, is that God will fight for us. And yet, it doesn't mean to sit and do nothing, right? So at the same time, the fact that God will fight for us, our efforts can seem futile against north, south, east, and west, this enemy coming, and we're so exposed. And nobody could be any more vulnerable than a wallless city, and even a half-walled city. No. And so they're saying, whatever we do to mitigate against this disaster on the horizons, we do so knowing God will fight for us. Yeah, he did it with 300 of Gideon's men against 135,000 Midianites, right? So we know God doesn't need good odds. One man with God, one woman with God is a majority. It's this way. And yet our efforts can seem futile sometimes. But when done in faith, they're mighty. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the promises that are enduring from Nehemiah's time all the way down to present. For each of us that may be experiencing a bit of this, a bit of this on some level, or maybe on every level. God, we thank you that you haven't changed at all, and that you are the God that comes to us, whether walking on the water, however, but you come to us, you never leave us, you're there to offer help, and faith is most significant and most meaningful to us and most formative to our lives when it is accomplished in the worst of circumstances, when every reason to quit, every reason to be afraid is on the horizon, and we can make endless lists. And yet you, God, the God who is sufficient in himself, it doesn't matter if it's a, some medical diagnosis, that takes us by surprise, some economic mishap, loss of job, lost period, our ability to emotionally cope with our circumstance, whatever it is, you are sufficient in yourself. And we can rely and rest fully in you. And we praise you for that and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.